Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jamal Watson, and I am the author of The Student Debt Crisis, America's Moral Urgency. And welcome to our panel discussion today, exploring issues in this book. 45 million Americans are impacted by student debt at the tune of $1.7 trillion. And we've assembled an outstanding panel to help unpack many of the issues that's included in this book here, The Student Debt Crisis, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm not going to read their bios in full because we'd be here all day, but let me just quickly introduce our panelists, and then we will get started. If you have questions, I invite you to put your questions in the chat box, and I will try to get to as many of the questions as possible before the hour expires. Let me introduce the distinguished professor in the College of Education and Human Ecology at The Ohio State University. She is one of the world's leading scholars on gifted and talented education, multicultural and anti-racist education, and urban education. And when we call, she always comes through. Dr. Donna Y. Ford. Welcome, Dr. Ford. Glad you are here. My dear brother, who is one of the nation's most preeminent scholars and activists. He is an assistant professor in the Center for the Study of Higher and Postsecondary Education at the University of Michigan. His research focuses on race and racism, systems of oppression, and structures of domination in the U.S. higher education and social context. And again, this brother is bad. When I was working on the book, I used so much of the work that he had done for the NAACP and others to help understand this issue. So I want to welcome Dr. Charles H.F. Davis. Welcome, the third. Welcome to this conversation. And then my friend who is the Chief Operating Officer for the Professional Management Consulting Services. I've known her across the years. She's been a professor, an administrator, and her research, and she's a doctoral student, and her research focuses on first generation women of color pursuing graduate degrees. And so excited to have Professor Rehva Jones joining this discussion. Welcome, Rehva. And finally, we have Tylik McMillan, who is an advocate and strategist and has served in leadership roles with a number of organizations, including having led the College and Youth Division of the National Action Network, led by the Reverend Al Sharpton. And he is featured in the book. So, welcome, Tylik McMillan. Welcome to all of the panelists. Again, looking forward to the conversation. So, I just want to jump in if we can, because I want to be mindful of the time here. And I want to start off with you, Dr. Davis, if we can, to help frame why we should think about student debt as a civil rights issue.
Yeah, thank you, Jamal. Always a pleasure to be in conversation and community, and really great to be on this panel with colleagues. As you can imagine, I don't get as many opportunities to see this wonderful array of Black faces, given my geopolitical context. But I think part of this, and I think others will attest to this on the call, right, is that our understanding of student debt is deeply framed by wealth inequality in this country, right, which we know from the very beginning has been a racialized phenomenon. We know that our ancestors are deeply, if not wholly, responsible, right, for the ability for this nation to profit in the ways that it has. And racial capitalism teaches us this has been an ongoing endeavor. And so I think for me, part of it was looking at just the racial wealth gap in general, right? So one of the things that we know about the overall wealth held in the United States is that 86% of that wealth is held by white families by comparison to 2.9% held by Black families. And so when we look at that grave disparity in just wealth, we can think about that in the context of housing, right? We know that housing and the opportunity to own homes has, tremendous impact on abilities to generate wealth, but because of things like redlining, right, and the inability to acquire loans, even despite having worked and tilled the land, have exacerbated that. And so when we look at student debt, that it fits squarely within this narrative. And in many ways, what we understand from our work and many of the work of folks who are on this panel is that the student debt burden is also a racialized phenomenon that exacerbates that wealth gap, right? And so we often find that Black students, even those who have had opportunities to access financial aid or grant packages but come from low-income backgrounds, are often leaving college in a worse financial state than they entered. right?
Mhm.
And so I think we cannot decouple this idea of class or socioeconomic status from race, right? And I think this has been a lot of that broader discourse is the idea that we can have, say, a class-based, quote unquote, affirmative action system that would not have to attend to race. What we know to be true is that Black students, by and large, are taking out or borrowing loans rather at a rate of 86% by compared to 68% of their white counterparts, right? So there's already a disparity there. And we know they also have to borrow at least $10,000 more than their white counterparts. So juxtaposed to, again, the financial situation from which they come, these students are also more vulnerable in the inability to pay back that loan because they're going into a racist and sexist labor market, right? We know that the same degree for us does not work the same as it does for other people in that labor space. So we're also put at a deficit for not only what it is we have to borrow, how much we have to borrow, but the inability to pay that back because we're unable to get the jobs that we are duly qualified for.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Davis. Tylik, let's go to you if you can help us again think about this as a civil rights issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I'm grateful to be here and to be amongst so many amazing folks in the space. I admire all of your work, and I think the work that you all do helps us lead and continue to push this urgent issue forward. But absolutely, it is a racial and generational justice issue, as I believe. Young people, especially Black and Brown youth, are told that education is the pathway forward. Yet we graduate shackled with debt that locks us out of building wealth and buying homes or even choosing careers based on our passions instead of survival. And oftentimes we see young people and many folks, having to choose careers not based off of what they went to school for, but based off of survival and making sure that bills are paid, that food is on their table, that they are able to pay for their medicines, and that I think that's just unfair. It's a systemic oppression. Repackaged as opportunity. And I think the biggest barrier is that it's too many decision makers telling students and telling folks that student debt is an individual choice instead of a structural injustice that we have in this country. And I think until we treat it as a moral crisis tied to racial equity and liberation, we will, you will get to see real progress, and real progress will stall until we treat it as the issue that it is, and that is a racial equity and liberation issue.
Thank you so much. Rehva Jones, I'm coming to you. Just curious how you sort of frame this and see this. And you're on mute. You have to unmute.
Yes, thank you so much again for being here and to this distinguished panel. I'm just overjoyed to have this conversation. I don't think what I found is strays too much from what we've heard this morning. But where I think my focus is we've reached a point where higher education increasingly functions like a Veblen good. And in economics, that's a good where the demand rises as the price increases. The cost itself signals prestige, and graduate education is behaving more this way. The more expensive it becomes, the more it's marketed as the exclusive pathway to leadership and mobility, even when the returns do not justify the price. So my research zooms in on what it means for Black women with debt-financed MBAs. And I specifically chose that degree because it is hallowed in all sectors, and it is supposed to be the great equalizer, right? But I find this paradox that I call appropriated value, and that is these women hold some of the most marketable degrees in our economy, yet the payoff, higher salaries, promotions, stability, is consistently suppressed. Their student debt becomes both a weight, a monthly financial strain, and a weapon that, as we've heard already, limits choice and locks them into roles that they don't necessarily want to be in. Dr. Watson, I'm grateful because while your book maps the significant structural shifts of credential inflation and debt, my work shows how those forces land most forcefully on Black women who already have the highest labor force participation rates and remain critical to the nation's economic health.
Absolutely. We want to delve into that as well because we know that Black women, as you just pointed in general,
Mhm.
carry the largest amount of debt in terms of any demographic group, which again is when we talk about the intersectional connections here. It's not surprising given the racism and the sexism that they often face. So I want to go to you, Dr. Ford, to help us again understand this as a civil rights issue and why this is so urgent now.
Thank you, and I'm pleased to be here, and I echo what my colleagues have said. And your book is just phenomenal, and I'm just great that I'm just happy and grateful that it has been published. So, with that said, and a lot has already been said that I would have said, mine will be probably a little briefer. So, my focus, like you said, is on access, denied access to gifted and talented programs, advanced placement, and those kinds of things. And that is a pipeline or bridge to the most elite um, uh, colleges and universities in this nation. And so we have to keep that in mind. And, I know we could talk about that a little bit later. But with that said, when I think about this being a civil rights issue, I think about this notion of the public good. I also think about this not just equality, but we need to focus more on equity, doing something different because our students' needs are different. And that includes, I really want to talk about this later, testing issues and specifically test bias. These opportunity gaps are just real, and they truly lead to our not having access to what it takes to not just be successful in higher education, but to get these the funding so that we don't have to be indebted and be in these crises. I also want to say that when I think about civil rights, and this topic, we need to focus on, like the U.S. will always talk about what it wants to do globally to be so competitive. But damn, if you don't allow more minoritized people, no more women, no more population who live in poverty to have access, because we are a large population, to higher education, then I don't see how we're going to be able to minimize this crisis that you have written about. I also want to say that when we have more access to higher education, meaning as a civil rights issue, then we can prevent underachievement, which means you have this potential, but you're not reaching it because of whatever the barriers are. In this case, based on your book and more, is financial. All right. And then last, perhaps, when we have access as a civil rights to higher education, then not only do we decrease underachievement, but we also close racialized achievement gaps. And so this is about race, as already been said, it's about gender, but it's also about class. And it is a civil rights issue because we are all entitled and deserve an opportunity to have access to higher education, and that includes not just public colleges, private colleges, that includes elite colleges, but there's so many doggone barriers that is not happening, has not been happening, and this is why it is, as you said, a crisis and damn near a pandemic.
No, no, absolutely. And again, as Tylik mentioned, we're all told as children, right? We want you to be able to pursue higher education. We want you to be able to go to college. And yet all of these obstacles are in the way for access, as you pointed out, Dr. Ford. So Tylik, I want to start with you if I can, because you're featured in the book. And I wanted to feature you in the book because I wanted to tell your story. And I wanted to know if you could share a little bit about your journey and pathway to what got you passionate about this issue, because you, of course, had gotten accepted into the largest historically Black college and university in the nation, North Carolina A&T, but you were struggling, right, on whether or not you would be able to attend that institution. Tell us about it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I always love telling the story. And I say I'm grateful for not only, and my faith comes first, that God got me through my time and my when I thought I couldn't make it. My faith is what really would carry me through, and it is the love of my parents and the love of my community that supported me when I thought, you know, that I wouldn't walk across that stage. You know, as I said, at North Carolina A&T, the largest HBCU, I lived the reality of being young, Black, and ambitious, just like a lot of folks on HBCU campuses. But the weight of the cost of trying to do everything right, you know, I saw my peers, you know, every day we're living out our dreams and carrying the hopes of our families. You know, being a first generation college student, and yet the reward of pursuing education was often, you know, in the back of my mind. You know, I went to class and, you know, got good grades and graduated, you know, with honors. But, you know, every month I would think about, you know, hey, tuition is due at the first of the month. You know, am I going to be able to still go to class? And I think that contradiction, you know, set a fire in me. Is like, you know, why does somebody who has so much ambition, who is doing so well at their studies, you know, have to accept that my generation wouldn't just inherit these broken promises, but we, you know, that we are able to live out our full dreams and, you know, do these things. And that's why I committed myself to this fight. And I will also say, because, you know, it was in my DNA. You know, I grew up in a family that was committed to justice and standing up, you know, and speaking truth to power. Like I said before, I began working for Reverend Al Sharpton at a very young age. So I feel like I was baptized in the tradition of activism and community. And so I think me actually having that lived experience actually, you know, lit that fire in me even more. And I believe that not only the stories that, you know, I have felt, and the stories that I have saw my peers, you know, deserve to be centered in the national conversation and not erased. And so that is what really drew me into this. But like I said, I'm super grateful that I was able to go to a institution like North Carolina A&T, where my chancellor, you know, believed in me when my mother was battling cancer, my father was incarcerated, and, you know, I didn't know how I would, you know, pay through school. I thought I had to drop out. Here I am. You know, I was a highly successful student, you know, very involved in campus. You know, I'm doing national work, but yet I thought I had to drop out of school. And I'm like, it was a crazy reality for me, but I'm grateful that I had an institution like North Carolina A&T who invested in students like me, and I'm grateful for that. But I also know that is not the reality for every student. Not every student has that opportunity to have chancellors like Chancellor Harold Martin at North Carolina A&T, to have, you know, advisors and deans that, you know, would pull out the last dollar out of the you know, the budget to make sure that students like me stayed in school. And so I'm like, what can I do to ensure that nobody else has to experience, you know, what I experienced and what other many students experience in stories that go untold.
Yeah, and there are so many of those similar stories that I include in the book, and again, from all backgrounds, but again, from the minoritized community as well, very heavily represented for sure. So, Dr. Davis, when we think about like what institutions can do, right? Particularly like institutions that have a lot of money, because there are a lot of them. Um, Help me to understand, or help us to understand, what can particularly research institutions or those with large endowments do to help remedy this issue? Because there are things that institutions can do for sure, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in the broader, you know, context of our conversation, we often let institutions off the hook, right? And so what we see is that, you know, institutions are able to use tuition dollars for any number of things, right? And every institution sort of moves those dollars differently. And yet the person that's left holding sort of the, you know, associated debt with those dollars is the individual. And I think this goes back to, you know, the early articulation of, you know, what constitutes a public good, right, versus a private good, being that is there an individual or a larger societal benefit? And if we agree that there's a larger societal benefit, then institutions should bear a bit more of the burden associated, at least with, say, like the interest, right, that's being accrued on these dollars, because they kind of get off scot-free. They allow for us to be the middle people in the borrowing situation, use those monies for whatever they want to, and then we're left dealing with the debt, which I think is especially important when we think about this in the context of what we call like the neoliberal university, right? And so there are, certain analyses put out there, some of which are included in my own, the extent to which universities operate sort of like hedge funds with academic divisions, right? That like the research and teaching function are not really about public good, really about profiteering, right? And privatization and some of these other pieces. And so all that being said, I think about what types of reforms we can see. Well, we've seen some of them. We've seen, some institutions, for example, say, well, if your family makes, below this amount, then you are, free in terms of tuition costs at that school. But we know that there are other costs associated. One of the, studies that came out of the Penn Graduate School of Education a few years ago, rather, took note that even for programs that do what they call no loan or all grant aid programs, that students, simply to sort of keep up with the like social integration of those institutions, ended up having to take out money to do the types of, spring break experiences or distance learning experiences and study abroad that were not covered by a lot of these programs. So how do we think about that in a more comprehensive way that allows for not just academic access, but also social integration? I think would be important. I think another piece of this is being able to leverage the university's political capital, both in federal financial aid policymaking as well as in the state house. Often institutions, especially now, are adopting these positions of neutrality, but we know that colleges and universities are not neutral, that they have a lot of political muscle. They hire lobbyists in a number of spaces to advocate for their needs and desires as institutions, whether that be stadium rights and buildings, right, which is, again, another conversation, or other things that they're interested in. How could they not also leverage that political muscle to shape financial aid policy that would better support students to get access to the resources that they offer? And I think then the last thing that I would say, and we saw this during the pandemic, is institutions have to be much more conscientious of limiting or freezing tuition increases, right? We're seeing like exponential increases time over time where the same degree is costing more and more money, right? And I think that that is something that we know we can do, right? But we're choosing not to. And why is that? And part of that could be, attributed to what we call administrative bloat, right? This growing cost of administration of managing the university, because certainly faculty are not seeing those rises in their salaries, be that private or public. But what can they do to actually freeze and cap that for a duration, right? Not this sort of, intermediate step. Well, we'll do it under only these circumstances, because the pandemic has proven us anything, that there are things that we can do that we're choosing not to do that really are about the life affirmation, not just of sort of everyday people broadly, but Black people specifically. And we should see institutions make moves more in that direction.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Dr. Ford, I want to come to you because you've often talked about kind of being raised by a single mother in Cleveland. And I'm curious to know why this issue is so personal for you and the connection between some of the students that you encounter who have similar trajectories as well. And I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Thank you. Yes, I grew up in Cleveland as well as East Cleveland, and grew up with a single mom, and grew up in low income community. If you look at East Cleveland, almost everyone is on public assistance, and it's almost an all Black community. Okay, so this is not just, and I can hear this from the other colleagues, this is just not professional. This is personal, because I want people to have the same experiences that I have. I feel really blessed that I am, where I am today, but it is rare, very rare, that people growing up in my, from my background would even get to the level where we would have a PhD, no less, an undergraduate degree. So I was a really good test taker. I learned how to take tests. We were taught how to take tests at one point when I was in school, so I knew about how to do that. But I don't think that's done enough today, where we learn how to take tests, because you're not getting into colleges, especially these higher income colleges, and getting, I'm sorry, elite colleges, and getting scholarships if you don't have high test scores. So, I feel blessed. So we got to teach our students about test bias, about and about test wiseness. And I don't think many people know the difference between the two. So, for example, I'll ask students in my class, even now, we're here at Ohio State University, there's a question, an old question that said, what should you do if someone smaller than you starts a fight with you? Another question is, what should you well, anyway, let's just stop right there. What you do if someone smaller than you starts to fight with you? And if you say that you would fight the person back, then you would get 0 points. All right. And where I grew up, you better not put your hands on me because I'm gonna fight you back. But I know how to take a test, so I knew what not to say. I know what's in my head, what I'm gonna do, but I knew what not to put on paper. Another one is, what is a crib? And then our students today will say, it's a house. No, that is not the answer. But if you know about, test wiseness, you wouldn't respond that way. So I'm talking about what schools need to do so that we can have access to these higher scores and deal, with test bias. All right. So that really comes to mind to me, and I just feel blessed that I knew how to do both of those. All right. And but the other things I want to say is that from my own personal perspective and experiences, um, we need to have school counselors who are culturally responsive so that they can teach you what you need to do to gain access to some of the things and opportunities in order to have a better opportunity to do well on these measures, as well as to get higher levels of recommendations and to get these scholarships. Because honestly, Dr. Watson, I didn't pay a penny. I had no debt because I did so well on these doggone bias tests, which is rare. And so I'm saying we really need to focus on this, and I don't think that's talked about enough. And there was a study in Harvard Education Press that talked about easy items on the SAT and GRE and those kinds of things, and hard items. So I encourage listeners to look it up. We also need to make sure that we adopt that for us to get access to higher education, we need to make sure that leaders look at racialized norms. So, like, how do Blacks do on the SAT? How do Hispanics do on the GRE? And then based on that, they need to be setting criteria so that we can gain admittance. And that is not equal opportunity to get into higher education. That is equitable opportunity to get into higher education. We need to, I think this was kind of insinuated earlier, we need to have these sliding scales in terms of when you look at what the income is of the family, then by the number of children, by the way, not just the income period, flat income, but the number of children, then you need to then we can determine what the scholarships, etc., should be. So there's just so much more, and it's not just about it's about the pipeline. What do we need to be doing in P to 12, preschool to 12, so that we can get access to higher education? And I'm talking in general, but I want to see us in these damn elite colleges, as well. And that is one reason I also focus on gifted and talented education. All right, gifted and talented education, because those students get access to advanced placement classes and more, and they have a better chance, a higher probability of getting into the academy than those who are not in GATE. And Black children, when I say GATE, I mean gifted and talented education. Black children are underrepresented in gifted programs by almost 50%, Hispanics by around 40%. So we don't even have this opportunity. So we need to desegregate and integrate not only, P to 12, not only GATE, but also the academy.
Yeah, and perhaps one of the things we ought to do is reimagine testing altogether,
All together.
raising question of whether or not it makes sense for us to be testing people and then attributing scholarships to a test score as well. But that's another discussion. I know quite controversial,
Okay.
but it's something I think we need to think about
Well,
as
let
well.
me just say this. It is controversial, but the controversy, Dr. Watson and others, ended In October of 2021, when the American Psychological Association, APA, issued finally a formal apology admitting that they had been complicit in test bias. All these years, they knew these doggone damn tests were biased and they refused to admit it, but finally in 2021. So if anybody ever says, oh, tests aren't biased, then you better go back and look at APA's apology. And that is the organization, that you look at in many ways for all of these tests. And that's not just intelligence tests. That is also, what do you call it? Tests like the SAT and GRE and the LSAT, things like that. They are biased, period.
Yeah.
No question about it. And there's two types of bias. Well, three. One is there's economic bias. The other one is there's linguistic bias. And the third one is there is cultural bias in favor of middle and upper income whites. So it's not, like when we talk about culturally responsive, it's about, asking such questions as, how are, there's just so many questions coming to mind, but anyway, I gave two earlier.
Yeah.
I'm rushing,
Well,
not
yeah.
take up other people's time.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you raised that
Take
issue
it,
because again,
pick it up.
oftentimes when we think about scholarships, it's tied to this bias system, and so part of I think what we need to do is begin to deconstruct and perhaps even blow up the the entire system that is part of this problem as well. I want to go to you, Reva, if I can, because Dr. Davis talked about sort of what institutions, particularly elite institutions, can do. And I'm curious to know what the private sector could potentially do. I mean, I think back to 2019 when the businessman Robert Smith, right, he helped to clear the debt of the students at Morehouse. I think at $34 million dollars or $35 million. It was a large sum of money. Of course, we've also seen what philanthropist Mackenzie Scott has done in terms of her philanthropy in supporting minority serving institutions as well. Is there a role for private sector to be in conversation with, the public to address this issue for sure?
Yes, absolutely. Um, Primarily because degree inflation, right, it stems from the business sector using degrees as a proxy for skill or whatever other reasons, and they're basically mostly used as exclusionary devices. So I think the most obvious one would be, and I'm talking at the graduate education level specifically, but it's to fund the education directly. If your job or position requires you feel that it requires a master's degree or a PhD or some advanced degree, then be willing to fund it. Again, I think Dr. Davis alluded to this earlier, like, universities walk away scot-free, and we hold the bag, right? It's almost like a smart tax. People who want to go to school, they end up holding the bag in thousands of dollars in terms of loans. And the business sector doesn't pay anything either, right? So it's exclusively this individual thing that it should not be. Because as I mentioned earlier, there's this incredible degree inflation, but also funded directly if you think so. I think also role integrity standards would be helpful. So audit the job descriptions and the promotion criteria to ensure that they align with the actual skills required and not these inflated degree demands. When you talk about you hear allyship and mentorship, I like to term them as stabilization plans. Too often, Black women or Black people or minoritized people in general are elevated to what is often referred to as these precarious leadership roles, right? Where failure is almost guaranteed. And to provide the mentorship and the resources and the real authority so that leaders can succeed. as Dr. Ford was mentioning, create equitable pipelines, build pathways where Black women are not only enter, but thrive, right? Through fair promotions, pay equity, and leadership opportunities. There's also this, in my research, a lot of the participants talked about being elevated to positions, but not given the resources to perform or to be successful. And the term is, I think, glass cliff. So do a risk audit on that. Proactively identify and mitigate risk from the precarious assignments that disproportionately fall to Black women. And the economics on this is clear, right? If Black women have been afforded full equity in wages in employment, the US GDP could be $500 billion higher, 500 billion. And this is according to S&P Global. And 31% of American households are headed by Black women. So when their talent is suppressed by debt and inequity, the entire economy actually suffers. And I just want to put in this one little bug, because it irks me when people try to counter these arguments talking about meritocracy, right? And so this myth has become quite dangerous. It assumes, first of all, that there's a level playing field, which we know there is not. That if you work hard, you'll rise. But Black women, Black people, minoritized in general, start out with fewer resources. They face biased promotion systems and encounter credential demands designed to exclude. Calling it merit, right? It hides the structural barriers and it shifts the blame onto individuals, right? Instead of addressing systemic issues. And if corporations want to live up to the promise of meritocracy, the work begins with dismantling the inequities that keep Black women from receiving the return on investment that their education and labor already warrant.
Great points. Thank you so much. And I want to, of course, remind the audience that if you have a question, put it in the chat box, and we'll try to get to a few of those before we end. I also want to kind of raise the importance of the Pell Grant, right, which we all know really is for the neediest students going to college, which has been really stagnant, right? I mean, it has not grown. So there are organizations like the United Negro College Fund, the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, and others that have called for doubling the Pell Grant, which is about $7,300. Not enough money at all. So again, I think those are kind of immediate things that the government can do to address this issue. And Tylik, I wanted to come to you if I could, because again, during the last election, I know there was a real push among younger activists like yourself and others from the NAACP to try to push the Biden administration. And you got some steps there. It was certainly better than where we are now, but there was always some concern about maybe the reluctance of the administration to go even further as it related to canceling student debt. So can you talk about that process as well? Because I think it's really important to give that history.
Yeah, absolutely. We were on them day in and day out, protesting outside the White House, everywhere, and even I served as the youth director at the Democratic National Committee, and even in my position there, I was very heavy on not only the party stance on how they stood on student debt, but also how we push the administration, especially as we talked about more extensive, debt relief for folks. And I think even then, we continue to echo the fact that we need really bold solutions: full debt cancellation, interest-free federal loans, and the expansion, as you mentioned, of Pell Grants. And as I mentioned, I will continue to always echo this as a proud HBCU graduate. I will be remiss not to say the investment in historically Black colleges and universities. But more than policies, we need a shift in mindset that education is not a privilege, but it is a right. For far too long, access to higher education in this country, it has been treated as if it's something for those who can afford it, when in reality, it should be really the foundation of our society. And I think when we talk about education, it's not just about degrees. We're talking about freedom for folks. We're talking about people being able to be free, to live free, and also we also say that we live in a global economy where knowledge and skills it determines how competitive we are as a nation. And I think we cannot claim to lead the world if our own young people and our own people in this country are drowning in loans for simply trying to learn. And I believe that liberation for us all, it means that being able to live debt-free, without debt having to dictate our decisions and our choices. And I think to build that will, we have to organize, we have to share our stories, we have to have important conversations like this, we have to vote on our values, we have to keep reminding our leaders that the backbone of this democracy, it all comes when we invest in our children, we invest in the mindsets of education. And if policymakers and folks are not doing that, we have to shift our energy, we have to shift our turnout to make them deliver on these issues. And I think, continually to show up, whether it's organizing in the streets, as we say at National Action Network, organizing from the streets to the suites. It's important that we pull out all the stops. And I think, whether it's, the folks in the space of as we look at the educational pieces, or folks that are in the streets organizing, or folks or that simply have how we vote in the ballot box. We all have to use our power in the ways that we know how, and really shift this conversation and this narrative to ensure that we have the access to higher education, and that it's attainable for not some, but for all.
So from a practical point of view, and then I want to go to Dr. Davis, what does that look like for you? I mean, as an activist, does that mean, that all student debt is canceled? What does that look like for you?
What it looks like for me that for the full debt, that all student debt is canceled. When we say cancel student debt, we ain't talking about 10% of it. We ain't talking about 50% of it. We're talking about all student debt, because we understand, as I said before, canceling all student debt for all. We talk about all people. It closes the racial wealth gap, and it gives folks an opportunity to do the things like buy homes and invest in their children and do things like that. So we ain't talking about just a little bit of it. I mean, we'll take a little bit of it, but we want the whole thing.
Yeah.
We ain't,
Charles?
as we say, we ain't asking for the 30 cents. We want the whole damn dollar.
The whole dollar. Charles, you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in no uncertain terms, right? We need to cancel all of it. And we've, shown that through executive actions, things can be canceled. I think part of that problem is that they've been highly selective. And, per, sort of usual in the contemporary political discourse, Democrats have taken the path of least resistance, right? So they cancel the least objectionable, if you will, sets of debt. And so I think we have to be, steadfast in that commitment that all of this debt should be canceled, right? If it really is a public good and it is a right, then we shouldn't have to incur the private burden associated with that. So yes, all debt should be canceled. We shouldn't split hairs on, which debts, so forth and so on. Because again, it's creating so many implications for, again, life affirmation down the road. So absolutely, all debt needs to be canceled.
Can we talk for a second about for-profits? Because again, we know that so many African-American students get degrees from for-profits, which we know have had a history of predatory bias and all of that. And so can we talk a little bit about that? Anybody want to chime in on how we deal with for-profit institutions in this crisis? Because that's been
So I'll say a very short piece about this. I think sometimes we have to be careful about making these distinctions about sort of the explicit predatory nature of the for-profit enterprise when all universities are for profit, right? And they are built in a capitalist system that sort of drives itself on the extraction of resources from people and communities and the exploitation of its people. And so part of it is to recognize that the things that have happened in the for-profit sector, whether they be a little less regulated or because their credential doesn't have quite as much currency in the economy, right, which is also debatable depending on which for-profit you're talking about, right, are things that we want to be careful of, because I would argue that for as much as we look at the predatory nature of the for-profit enterprise itself, that, traditional, if you will, higher education has been equally, if not more detrimental as a culprit, in part because they've set the standard and the benchmark by which these institutions are capitalizing.
No, that's a very good point. Anybody else want to chime in on that?
I completely agree with what was just said. I believe that all institutions are for profit, whether they claim it or not. And even if they don't claim it, we need to look at it in that way and take steps to make sure that, we do what we can to get our students still, enrolled and not in debt.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Professor Jones, what advice would you give for students who may be undergraduates who are thinking about pursuing a graduate degree, but they're not sure if they want to accumulate additional debt? What advice would you give?
So thank you for that question. That is a real, that's reality, right? There's a lot of young people that are rethinking higher education in general, and especially graduate education. So I think I'd start by saying, just take your time and feel empowered to question that path and center their long-term flourishings, I guess is a good word, and not just what looks good on paper, right? You don't necessarily have to follow the script. And when I say look at the whole picture, tuition is only part of the cost. And we all know that Ed Trust fact that Black women end up owing more than the original principal after years of repayment, right? To a tune of like 13% more than what they borrowed. That's a dangerous number, because if you make those numbers real, suppose you borrow $80,000 at 6.5%. On a 10-year plan, that's about $900 a month, and roughly $108,000 repaid, which is $28,000 above the principal. And if you stretch that to 20 years, right, you get a monthly payment of $600 a month. So, okay, you've lowered your monthly payment, but you end up paying back $144,000. And that's nearly double the original loan. And so ask the program tough questions. What are the outcomes for graduates that look like you? Where are they placed? What are they earning? How long did it take them to get there? That kind of transparency matters. And I know that there's movement afoot in the undergraduate space. There are a couple of research places that have actually taken what they're calling the value of colleges and amplifying that a lot more than just the U.S. News and World Report rankings, but they're doing it in a different way that means more. I would also say prioritize funded routes. So fellowships, teaching research, assistantships, or employer-sponsored programs that can change the equation. Graduate debt doesn't necessarily have to be the default debt. But I think most importantly, I would say, remember your value beyond the credential. And so degrees can open doors, but so can your networks. Your leadership, your creativity, all of that carries weight. The women in my study actually taught me that ambition wasn't the problem. The problem is when the system asks you to mortgage your future just to be seen. And so for young people, it's just keep your ambition and stay anchored in the choices that allow you to thrive over the long term. I think that is probably the most important piece of advice that I can give. Like, don't just do, exercise muscle memory and just start signing on the dotted line for that promissory note. Don't do it. Ask questions and be skeptical about it, because it is a lot of money.
It is a lot of money. Yeah, great advice, Professor Jones. There's a question.
I'm sorry, Dr. Watson.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to say something. I agree with what has been said, and I appreciate every question you've raised. However, I want us to think about not just intervention, meaning a problem exists and here's what we're going to need to do about it. We need to talk about prevention. So
Yes.
what are schools doing to teach financial literacy, for example? And so that needs to be taught, I think, in all schools. And I know the name has changed, but when it was called Diverse Issues in Higher Education, I and another colleague, we published something on that, all right, about the need for financial literacy in not just most people. I mean, when it's taught, it's in high school, but if nothing else, it needs to be in middle school. All right. And then we can make more informed decisions and understand the pros and the cons of what we make. So that is called prevention. So rather than just intervention, we need to put the damn fire out. All right.
Yeah.
Prevent the fire. I'm sorry, not just put it out. Okay.
Mm.
So we need to be having conversations about what are you doing in Peter 12 so that there will be access to the academy.
Right.
Right.
So preparation versus just the
Preparation.
action. I think that's a good point. Thank you so much, Dr. Ford, for raising, because there are things that we can do certainly, and as you pointed out, can be done at a very, very young age. Here's a question that came in, which is, and Talik, this one I'm going to give to you. It says, has the Congressional Black Caucus made a statement regarding policy or legislation to solve this? Also, do the Democrats have the courage to move on this? It seems there's a lack of courage or desire to move forward on this, particularly in the climate that we're in during the Trump administration 2.0.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I just want to say, as I respond to this, I do not speak for the CBC or the party.
Understood.
But in fact, the CBC has taken steps related to student debt over the years. Um, uh, Even though, activists like myself will argue that it's not enough, I think it still remains a critical institution and player in this fight to push for bold solutions, especially as it relates to for Black and brown folks. I always push the CBC and the party to be a little more aggressive on their takes. But again, we live in a society where sometimes political correctness and playing the game of politics is the reality. And that is the reality of what the state that we're in, that politics is playing with people's lives. And we have to get out of a state of playing with people, playing politics with people's lives, because at the end of the day, as I mentioned before, when we talk about debt repayment and we talking about the fact of garnishing people's wages, we're talking about the fact that there's going to be mothers and parents who cannot afford to keep a roof over there's going to be folks who have to make the decision of whether or not they have to pay for their debt or pay for their medicine. And so people are having to face really costly decisions, and that's the reality that we're in. And so I always say, yes, the CBC is doing a push as it relates, but I definitely wish that we could do a bit more. And I think we have to understand the game that we're playing. And as I said, we're living in a time in DC where, there's certain things that we may not be able to push or see to fruition because there's some ideologies who just do not agree with the fact of where we are. But I think it's also important that we take that reality back to our local states and our local city councils, and then where we can intervene where some of these things are being lost at. And so that will be yes to my response.
But I was very encouraged by what I saw in recent years in terms of the level of activism and engagement from young people on this issue, like yourself and others. So I think there is some movement that's taking place to push even more moderate Democrats, perhaps, to go a little bit more to the left on this issue, I think, which I think is so important and needed right now. Charles, did you want to weigh in on that issue at all?
Yes, I just added to the chat that the CBC did publish an action brief in 2022 requesting that student loan debt be canceled, particularly for HBCU alumni. And so they did take that action. And then they also, in earlier part of this year, had a brief put out demanding the restoration of the public service loan forgiveness program, which we know has since been challenged and if not gone away. And so again, there are actions. I agree with my colleague here that more can and should be done, but it's going to be part and parcel, right? I think for those of us who come from that organizing tradition, understand that politics has played a multitude of ways, which include not just what's happening in Washington, what's happening around Washington. And so again, I want to sort of applaud and recognize the work of the NAACP Youth and College Division, both under Tiffany Lofton's leadership, but also Wisdom Cole's leadership, in really pushing these things forward, both at the sort of grassroots level as well as the policy level. But it's going to take both of these pushes for these changes to happen, because we understand, right, politics is a long game of political power and negotiating that power. And so our interests aren't always going to be represented in their immediacy. But of course, more can and should be done. And we also may just have to get, very different about the solutions that we have for our own communities, right? I think the part about financial literacy is important, and still, even with the financial literacy, right, we're still confronted with what Kiese Laymon would call these unhealthy choices, right? And many of us, I think, do know more than we're given credit for about what we're entering into. There's some specificity and nuance there, but folks know at the end of the day, either I take out this loan and I can buy this house, I take out this loan, I can buy this car, take out this loan and get this education. And if I don't do those things, then again, I don't have access to these life-affirming resources. So, the sort of last point I'll have that's a bit tangential is to say, we need to be thinking about the ways that higher education, if we take abolition seriously, right, as a philosophy and a means of practice, is that we have to stop allowing for higher education to be the sort of penultimate resource that determines whether you live or die. Right. And I think that's the challenge that we have in this country, of sort of relegating people who don't have access to these types of educational opportunities from having the types of jobs and wages, right? And even those who do have those degrees, not getting access to a living wage. This has to be more a part of that conversation, because again, we come from a time in which higher education wasn't a requisite, that people could make a life and a living, right? Or the means still of a life, as Du Bois would articulate in the form and function of a Negro college. So what does it mean to be in this moment now where this is a requisite to which we don't have access to? It means people are actually going to die as a consequence of not having access to higher education.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And when we talk about all of the other insecurities that students face, current students face, housing insecurity, food insecurity, often those are not part of the discussion as we're talking about the student debt crisis. And it's important for us to center those real concerns that individuals, are experiencing every day. Tylik, you talked about that, worried whether or not you're going to be kicked out of a class because your tuition isn't paid, or having to sleep on a couch at a friend's house, or not skipping meals in order to be able to attend that, or even thinking about the non-traditional students, right? Students who have kids, and how do we provide services so that they can take classes and actually have affordable childcare as well. And I think that institutions have not done a very good job at addressing that issue at all. Dr. Ford?
Yeah, and whoa, there's a lot that I want to say, but again, I'm thinking about what needs to be happening in Peter 12 to get us to bridge us. And I'm so proud that last week the Ohio State University announced that, in collaboration with Columbus State University, which is Columbus State Community College. If you go to the community college and graduate, you will automatically get a full scholarship to the Ohio State University.
Wow.
Period. And when that happened, I'm like, wait a minute, we're about to have this, this panel and discuss, the student debt crisis, your book. But that just made me so happy, so proud, because I know definitely that I could have benefited from it. And as a teen mother, single mom, myself, going to college, I needed assistance too in terms of housing and other kinds of things. And at that time, Ohio State didn't have it, so I couldn't go. I had to stay in Cleveland, and I went to Cleveland State, which I'm not complaining about. But I'm just saying, we need this bridge. I know people don't use pipeline anymore, but this bridge from community college, these 2-year institutions, to these 4-year institutions. absolutely no funding. And
Yeah.
that is wonderful.
Yeah. We have 2 minutes left. I just want any parting comments, just quickly, things that folks can do right away, right today, to at least try to get involved in this issue. So, Professor Jones, any suggestions of what folks can do quickly?
Mentorship.
Mm,
Mentor young people. There are plenty of opportunities out here to mentor young people. There are a lot of scholarships out here. The Williams Franklin Foundation Scholarship is one that I can think of that actually have mentoring components to it. And it's best when we're mentored by us. And so we can hear these stories in real time,
all right.
and get that advice that we need.
All right. Tylik, quickly. We've got 1 minute.
Yeah, I will say, that borrower shouldn't carry that as a personal shame, but really as a collective wound. When we root this movement in lived experiences of our own stories, we build a coalition of not just fighting debt, but reimagining what economic justice actually looks like. And so this is it's not shame to have debt.
All right. Dr. Davis?
I would just echo everything that my colleagues mentioned.
All right. Any last words, Dr. Ford?
Yeah, just do your best to get your students and your children into, I'm going back to Peter 12, into, I'm not just saying gifted education, but advanced placement. Listen to this. The College Board has said you do not have to be identified as gifted to get into AP classes. You just have to request that you want to be in AP classes. And that is one of the best ways that you can get into, higher education.
Yeah.
And so get your children into these advanced classes. We deserve it, and fight against underrepresentation and the racism that exists in P12.
Excellent. Thank you so much to my panelists. Again, the link is there for the book. You can grab a copy of it. Look forward to engaging in conversations with you all that will continue beyond this. Thank you all so much for all that you poured into us today. I appreciate you all. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.